All right, good afternoon. I'm Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Erin Campbell, and with me today are State Economist Dr. Becker and State Budget Director Anna Mingi. Together, we will present the February 2025 Budget and Economic Forecast. I want to begin by acknowledging the hard work of Dr. Becker and his economic analysis team, pulling together an economic forecast during a time of significant change and uncertainty at the federal level. I also want to thank Anna Mingi and our budget team for their work developing the budget outlook, as well as the many other staff at MMB and in our partner agencies who provided the information necessary to present this budget forecast. Minnesota is one of 14 states that show a 4-year window into our state's budgetary and economic outlook in our twice-yearly forecasts. We analyze a large amount of data to develop our forecasts, which represent the best financial projections we can provide based on the information available when we prepare them. In this forecast, we continue to refine our projections for the budget years, FY 26-27, which will provide essential information policymakers can use for developing the next state biennial budget. And we also update our projections for the planning years, FY 28 and 29. Finally, I want to underscore that, like other states, we are closely monitoring unprecedented changes at the federal level, changes that are still very much in flux. We are still getting a sense of federal policy direction under the new administration, and there are many key details we don't know yet, including the impact of any future congressional funding decisions, which could have major implications for the national and state economy, as well as for the Minnesota's budget. After our presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions. For the budget biennium FY 26-27, the overall picture remains largely unchanged from what we presented in November, with the main difference being a widening gap between the forecast expenses and revenues. The projected balance at the end of FY 26-27 is now $456 million, which is $160 million less than our previous estimates. This means we will have less money to carry over into fiscal years 28-29, where we continue to forecast a deficit now totaling just under $6 billion. A common theme you'll pick up on today is the projections for both revenue and spending are higher, largely because of the impact of inflation. While individual income and sales tax revenues are a bit higher than previously estimated, those gains are offset by higher spending, driven by growth in our two largest segments of our budget, education and healthcare. As I mentioned earlier, unknowns regarding federal policy changes and their impacts introduce considerable forecast risk, which Dr. Becker will say more about in a few minutes. This slide shows the projected FY 26-27 budgetary balance in this forecast in the middle column compared to the November forecast estimates on the left. The column on the right shows the difference between the two. At the top of this slide, you'll see that the beginning balance is $10 million less than we projected in November. That is because we now project the ending balance for FY 24-25 to be just slightly lower than we'd previously forecasted. The projected balance at the end of fiscal years 26-27 appears under the lowest horizontal line. As you can see, we now forecast a positive balance of $456 million, again, $160 million less than we'd forecasted in November. At the bottom of the slide, you can see what the balance would be if we did not include discretionary inflation in the totals. Discretionary inflation consists of the estimated cost to maintain current service levels, and it's important to note that the 2025 legislature would first have to appropriate those funds. The increased levels of spending do not automatically go into effect under law. If inflation were not added to those line items, we would expect to end fiscal years 26-27 with a balance of $1.6 billion, which is $59 million more than estimated in November. That increase occurs because the cost of discretionary inflation to maintain the current service levels has grown since November by $219 million. So when we remove discretionary inflation, the available resource appear greater than forecast in November. Any unspent balance from FY 26-27 rolls over to the next biennium, meaning any new spending in this upcoming legislative session would reduce the amount available to soften the projected deficit in FY 28-29. By now, you've probably become familiar with the format of this slide, which looks very similar to November, but it has been updated for this forecast. We'll start with the dark blue bar farthest to the left. This shows the $3.7 billion projected balance in FY 24-25 that we expect will carry forward, becoming our starting balance in 26-27. Moving to the next set of blue columns, our starting balance of $3.7 billion in FY 26-27 is reduced by the size of our structural imbalance, or the amount that our spending in FY 26-27 exceeds revenues. This reduces a projected balance at the end of FY 26-27 by $2.1 billion. When you include an estimated $1.1 billion in spending for discretionary inflation, we're left with a balance of $456 million at the end of FY 26-27. If left unspent, that balance would be available to carry forward into FY 28-29. So we'll move over to the yellow columns on the right, which represent FY 28-29, again, where we've got a starting balance of $456 million. During fiscal years 28-29, we expect spending to exceed revenues by nearly $4 billion. When you add $2.5 billion in discretionary inflation to the mix, we're left with a projected deficit of just under $6 billion. That is about $845 million more than we had projected in November. Now, this doesn't show up on the slide, but if we remove inflation from the estimates, we would show a projected deficit of $2.4 billion in fiscal years 28-29, which is $393 million more than we'd anticipated in November. Constitutionally and statutorily, Minnesota is required to enact a balanced budget for the coming biennium, which in this case will be for fiscal years 26 and 27, where we do still estimate a small surplus. But as you can see, spending decisions made this legislative session will have impacts on the planning years where we anticipate significant challenges. On top of that, changes underway at the federal side could significantly impact the outlook that we are presenting today, including how much we ultimately have to work with from a budgetary perspective. With that, I'd like to invite State Economist Dr. Becker to the podium to cover our economic and revenue outlook.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. I'm Anthony Becker, Minnesota State Economist. I'm going to start with a review of the U.S. economic outlook, highlighting the significant changes since November, move next to Minnesota's economy, review the forecast risks, and finally review our new revenue forecast for the two biennia. Since Minnesota's budget and economic forecast was prepared last November, the outlook for U.S. economic growth has been revised upward for 2025, but slightly lower growth is now forecasted for 2026 through 29. We've also seen significant upward revisions in the forecasts for inflation in both 2025 and 26 in all of the major price indices. Key interest rates are expected to remain above the November forecast levels, as the Federal Reserve is now projected to hold off on rate cuts because of rising inflation. Minnesota's economy is predicted to remain strong in the near term with a continued tight labor market, low unemployment, and rising real wages. At both the national and state levels, there is significant uncertainty surrounding trade, fiscal, and immigration policies. These uncertainties contribute to substantial downside risks through all the years of the forecast. Our macroeconomic consultant, S&P Global Market Intelligence, released their baseline forecast to us on February 10th, 2025. They assumed a 10% universal tariff, 20% tariff on China, and a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum imports. They did not include any retaliatory tariffs in their assumptions. We now have higher tariffs, including tariffs on Canadian and Mexican products, though the Mexican product tariff has been stayed, apparently for 1 month, along with substantial retaliatory tariffs in place or soon to be implemented from major trading partners. These are not included in the forecast. SPGMI's baseline forecast assumes that the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates once in 2025 and then pause further rate cuts until 2026. However, if inflation persists or even increases, the Fed may not lower its target interest rate as much as assumed in the baseline forecast. SPGMI assumes that current federal personal income tax policies are extended beyond their scheduled 2026 expiration. For corporate taxes, they assume the tax rate will be reduced to 15% from the current 21% for corporations that produce domestically. In addition, they assume increases in or suspension of the debt ceiling as needed. Finally, SPGMI has reduced their forecast for net international migration by 500,000 people per year relative to Census Bureau projections for the years 2025 through 28. Please also understand that in addition to the recent tariffs I've mentioned, the forecast assumptions do not incorporate any effects of federal worker terminations, contract suspensions, or interruptions in federal payments. In the first chart, we show the SPGMI forecast for annual growth in real GDP. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, or BEA, now estimates that real GDP grew at an annual rate of 2.3% in the fourth quarter of 2024, substantially faster than they had assumed it would in their November forecast. SPGMI predicts that some of that momentum will carry into 2025. As a result, the forecast for 2025's GDP growth is now 0.3 percentage points higher than it was in November. The February 25 baseline forecast assumes that the administration's trade and immigration policies all contribute to higher inflation in 2025 and 26. As a result, interest rates are forecast to remain higher for longer than previously. Higher borrowing costs and a stronger U.S. dollar are expected to constrain growth by reducing private investment, net exports, and some forms of household consumption. Consequently, SPGMI's forecast for real GDP growth has been revised downward in each year from 2026 through 2029. This chart shows SPGMI's forecast of annual inflation rate as measured by the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. The U.S. inflation rate, as measured by both the CPI and the Federal Reserve's preferred measure, the Core Personal Consumption Expenditure Index, Core PCE, are forecast to rise in 2025. The CPI in January was 3.3% higher than 1 year earlier. Also in January, year-over-year core PCE inflation was 2.6%. Progress on lowering core PCE inflation has stalled since June, when it was also 2.6%. The current baseline forecast depends on the Federal Reserve's ability to further curb inflation. SPGMI projects CPI inflation will remain elevated at an annual rate of about 3% through 2026, before falling closer to 2% for 2027 through 29. Core PCE inflation is forecast to also remain elevated through 2026 before falling to the Federal Reserve's 2.0 target in 2027 through 29. Here we show the federal funds rate and the 30-year fixed mortgage rate. SPGMI now predicts only one rate cut in 2025, with further rate cuts paused until mid-2026. In November, they had projected multiple rate reductions over the next 2 years. The federal funds rate and other interest rates, like the 30-year fixed mortgage rate, are closely but not perfectly related. When the Federal Reserve raises the federal funds rate, it puts upward pressure on mortgage rates by increasing banks' borrowing costs. Mortgage rates and other long-term rates also respond to lenders' inflationary expectations. In this forecast, because of a higher federal funds rate and higher inflation expectations, SPGMI forecasts the 30-year fixed rate mortgage will remain above 6% into 2027. If inflation rises above the forecasted levels, the Federal Reserve may act less aggressively in lowering interest rates than assumed in this baseline. Higher interest rates would tend to reduce private investment, both business and residential, and some forms of consumer spending, dampening GDP. Turning now to the Minnesota outlook. A crucial variable influencing Minnesota's individual income tax liability is total wage and salary income. As employers face increased competition to fill open positions and businesses make investments in technologies that enhance productivity, wage and salary income per worker is expected to continue to increase. While our estimates for wage growth in 24 and 25 are little changed since November, our forecast for wage and salary disbursements in 2026 is 1.2 percentage points higher than we had forecasted in November. This results mostly from higher inflation in 2025. The demographic reality of Minnesota's baby boomers aging out of the workforce and the assumed limits on international migration, coupled with the state's already high labor force participation rate, will continue to limit employers' abilities to add jobs. The state's labor market has cooled somewhat from the record low unemployment rates and record high job vacancy rates that we experienced over the past 3 years. The unemployment rate in Minnesota remains low at 3.3%, 0.8 percentage point below the U.S. rate in December. Although the unemployment rate has increased slightly over the past year, this is still a low unemployment rate compared to our history, and Minnesota still has a tight labor market, with 16 job openings for every 10 unemployed workers in the state. I'd like now to highlight some forecast risks, or things that may push the true path, or push the actual path of GDP and incomes off of the baseline forecast. First, SPGMI's February outlook does not fully incorporate potential tariffs or trade policy uncertainties. Tariffs have the potential to cause additional inflation, which would likely trigger a response from the Federal Reserve in the form of higher interest rates or delayed lowering of rates. These higher rates would tend to suppress private investment, both residential and non-residential, and consumers' purchases of big-ticket items, such as motor vehicles and some durable goods. Further, policy uncertainty can cause businesses and consumers to be less willing to take on debt, which could also reduce investment and consumption. Second, policy changes and uncertainties at the federal level introduce important forecast risks through employment. The projection for federal government employment has changed considerably in recent weeks, but is not yet accounted for in this forecast. The spillover effects of federal spending pauses and contract terminations are also not accounted for in this forecast. Third, SPGMI assumes suspension or raising of the debt ceiling, extension of the provisions of the 2017 Tax Act, a reduction of the corporate tax rate, some exclusion of overtime and tip income, and no reductions to Social Security or Medicare benefits. Deviations from these assumptions could lead to economic outcomes that differ substantially from SPGMI's baseline forecast. Fourth, the current baseline forecast depends on the Federal Reserve's ability to further reduce annual inflation rates to their target rate of 2%. If inflation persists above the target level, the Fed may delay interest rate reductions compared to what is assumed in the baseline forecast. As I've already mentioned, higher interest rates would tend to suppress GDP growth. In addition, the possible effects of proposed tariffs and immigration policies could put upward pressure on prices and wages, threatening the forecasted monetary policy path. And high federal deficits and national debt could weigh negatively on economic growth in the long term. Finally, with 28 months remaining until the end of the 26-27 biennium, even small changes in the assumed rates of growth in important revenue sources can generate large changes in the revenue outlook for this biennium. Moreover, uncertainty in federal policies, coupled with the difficulty of projecting long-range economic conditions and taxpayer responses to law changes, warrants caution when using forecasts for the FY 28-29 biennium. There are some potential upside risks in this forecast. If the administration does not fully implement its proposed tariffs, or if it rescinds some of the announced tariffs, there would be less inflationary effect. There is some upside risk that the fiscal stimulus from promised tax cuts and exclusions would add to real GDP growth. Over the longer term, technological advances could improve productivity and raise economic growth above the baseline forecast. Let's turn now to the revenue forecast. The first two columns of the table show our current forecast for the next biennium and the change from the November forecast. And the second two columns show the same for the FY 28-29 biennium. Total revenues for the 26-27 biennium are now forecast to be about 1% higher than in November. Individual income tax receipts are also forecasted to be higher than in the previous forecast for both biennia. We now know the tax liability for tax year 23, and it forms the base for this forecast. It is slightly higher than we had estimated it would be in November, raising the starting point for this income tax forecast. Beyond FY 25, three primary factors are driving the individual income tax forecast, and these are a higher forecast for wage and salary disbursements that I showed earlier, a higher forecast for capital gains realizations and interest income, and a lower forecast for non-farm business income. Sales tax revenue is higher in both the FY 26-27 and FY 28-29 biennia than in our prior forecast. This is due to higher than expected net sales tax receipts since November and an increased forecast for taxable sales, such as sales of durable goods. For corporate revenues, a higher base from higher receipts so far this fiscal year and a slightly higher forecast in FY 25 is offset by a lower forecast for corporate profits for fiscal years 2026 through 29. The net effect is a very small decrease in the corporate tax revenue forecast in this biennium and a decrease of $39 million in the forecast for next. All other revenue is now expected to be higher in both biennia compared to our November forecast, and this is mostly due to higher investment income on state fund balances. I'll now turn the briefing over to State Budget Director Anna Mingi.
Thank you, Dr. Becker, and good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. I'm Anna Mingi, State Budget Director at Minnesota Management and Budget, and today I'm going to walk through changes in the state spending forecast. This slide is a table that you may be familiar with, which outlines anticipated changes in general fund spending in the budget biennium of fiscal years 2026 and 27, as well as upcoming planning years of 2028 and 2029. If you look at the very bottom of the table, you can see that total spending is projected to exceed our November estimates by $790 million in 26 and 27, and $960 million in 2028 and 2029. So let me walk you through the table to give you a sense of what's contributing to this change. The top line, E12 education, historically the largest area of spending in the general fund, is expected to be $198 million above November estimates in the first biennium and $339 million higher in the tails. And this is driven by increases in both general education as well as special education. In general education, spending is higher than previously anticipated due to a higher forecast of pupils, students showing up for school across the state, and increases in the basic formula allowance resulting from higher inflation. In addition, special education spending is higher than we previously expected, as school districts spend more on things like wages and transportation to provide services to students. On the next line, Health and Human Services spending is also above previous estimates, in this case by $338 million in the first biennium and $359 million in the second. This forecast reflects additional costs resulting from a population with more complex healthcare needs. Higher long-term care spending contributes $186 million higher cost in the first biennium and $157 million in the planning years due to changes in long-term care rates and caseload. As you may recall, most disability waiver rates are increased every 2 years to account for inflation. This forecast assumes larger inflationary adjustments for those services than we previously projected. We have also seen faster growth in the use of these services than we assumed in November. Another driver of the change in Health and Human Services spending is higher utilization of weight loss drugs, which is expected to increase MA spending by $80 to $90 million per biennium. The forecast at this point doesn't assume sort of any longer-term savings that may accrue to the program, and is instead focused on the near-term known impacts to our managed care contracts. On the next line, you can see property tax aids and credits spending is slightly above previous estimates. I'll just keep moving down to our debt service forecast, which looks relatively flat. You see slightly higher in the first biennium and slightly lower in the tails. Because of higher interest rates, the budget forecast now assumes a smaller bonding bill in the 2025 legislative session of $700 million, and those savings help to offset some of the costs of the state coming through higher interest rates. All other areas of the state budget are relatively unchanged, and the last line I would highlight is the line labeled discretionary inflation, where you can see that the cost is estimated to reach $1.1 billion in 2026 and 27, which is $219 million above November estimates. This increase is due directly to a higher forecast of the Consumer Price Index. This number is meant to be a guide for policymakers about the cost of funding state services in the wake of rising prices. We refer to it as discretionary inflation because it's only calculated for programs where cost increases aren't already automatically built into their funding formulas. I'd note that about 60% of the general fund is not actually included in this inflationary calculation because of the way that they are funded. It is really important to emphasize that this money doesn't flow automatically to programs. It has to be appropriated by the legislature, and policymakers have the choice, the discretion, to address inflationary pressures, to spend this money on something else, or to leave it unspent, which would benefit the general fund bottom line. So all of those changes combined add up to the bottom line change of $790 million in the first biennium and $960 million in the second. So let me dive into some of the trends underlying this summary information. This slide depicts general fund spending starting in 2024, the most recent year of actual data, through our forecast for 2029. It splits the general fund into three categories: education, health and human services, and all other. Typically, education and health and human services have been the largest areas of state spending. In 2026 and 27, they are expected to account for almost 3/4 of the general fund. You may notice on this slide the significant decline in the light blue bar from 2024 to 2026. That represents the end of the significant one-time spending that was enacted in the 2023 legislative session, which was concentrated in areas like capital investment and housing. However, that's not the most important takeaway from this slide. E-12 education and health and human services, as you can see, grow faster than the rest of the state budget. But for the first time ever, health and human services is expected to become the largest area of the state budget in fiscal year 2029, as you can see that green line sort of passing the dark blue. As I've discussed in previous forecasts, this is largely driven by faster spending on long-term care services. Now let me turn to changes in the education forecast. As you saw, education spending is projected to be above previous estimates in 2026, 27, and 28 and 29. A significant driver of this change is the impact of inflation on the basic formula. Basic revenue is the largest aid stream within general education. It provides a statutorily determined per pupil amount to school districts. And beginning in 2026, that per pupil amount will be tied to inflation. We now project that the rate of inflation driving those changes is higher than the November forecast. The chart shows those projected increases in the formula allowance with the dark blue bar representing our current forecast and the dashed line representing November. By 2028 and 2029, we project a 1% increase in the basic formula allowance relative to November estimates. And while 1% might not sound like a very big number, it has significant costs when applied to a base of about $14 billion. I'd now like to pivot and discuss an area of risk in our spending forecast. As we've discussed in previous slides and in recent forecasts, Health and Human Services spending has grown from previous estimates and is growing quickly over time, driven largely by our Medical Assistance Program, the state's Medicaid program. But it's important to keep in mind that for every dollar the state spends, the federal government is spending even more because they pay for roughly 56% of state medical assistance spending. This chart shows projected medical assistance spending by group and type of service. And on it, the state spending is the dark blue at the bottom of the bars, and federal spending is the green and light blue. In the total, the federal government is projected to provide $26 billion to medical assistance in the 26-27 biennium. And this underscores how sensitive our budget is to changes in federal funding. Because MA is a state entitlement program, reductions in federal funding will result in increased costs to the state budget. The U.S. House recently passed a budget resolution that calls for significant spending reductions in the committee overseeing Medicaid. The budget resolution doesn't address what policy levers Congress would use to achieve these savings, it merely sets a target. But these reductions would result in billions of lost federal Medicaid funding to Minnesota every biennium, which is not reflected in our spending forecast. A number of options have been discussed, such as capping the growth in the federal share of Medicaid or eliminating an enhanced federal match on a group known as the Medicaid expansion population. In Minnesota, this group includes roughly 230,000 adults without children for whom the state receives 90% federal match on the cost of services. On the chart, it's the bar on the far right labeled adults without children. For this group, the federal government covers 90% of the cost versus 51% for other groups. The difference between the 51 and the 90% is called the enhanced match. And in 26 and 27, eliminating the enhanced match in services for adults without children would result in a $2.4 billion hit to the state budget. This forecast assumes no reduction in federal Medicaid funding at this time because the actual congressional action is unknown. However, the chart demonstrates the extent to which our state budget is reliant on federal Medicaid dollars for all of the services we provide to this program. With that, I will turn it back to the Commissioner to discuss our long-term budget outlook.
All right, thank you, Anna. This slide shows the long-term budget outlook. It compares our forecast revenues against our estimated spending for this coming biennium and the next without including any unspent projected balances or transfers to our budget reserve. As a reminder, this is what we call our structural balance. In fiscal years 26-27, projected spending is $67.8 billion compared to $64.5 billion in revenues, leaving a structural imbalance of about $3.3 billion. Then in FY 28-29, total spending is estimated to rise to $74.3 billion, compared to $67.8 billion in revenues, creating a $6.5 billion gap in the planning years. You might notice the $6.5 billion gap is larger than the projected $6 billion deficit in the FY 28-29 biennium. The reason that the number on this slide is larger is because it doesn't include any of the money that we would be carrying forward from the previous biennia. This slide simply shows what we are estimated to take in during both biennia versus what we are projected to spend. On the right-hand side of the column, you can see the biennial growth column, which illustrates that we do expect revenues to continue to raise by 2.6% annually. Estimated spending, including inflation, will increase at a faster rate of 4.7%, but if we take out discretionary inflation, spending would still grow, but at a lower rate of 3.8%. As you've heard during this presentation, rising inflation is one major takeaway from this forecast. Another that is not reflected in the forecast numbers is the federal budget uncertainty. Federal funding is critical to Minnesota. 1/3 of our state budget comes from federal funds. In FY 26-27, we estimate Minnesota will receive $45 billion in federal funds, with more than half of that attributed to Medicaid funding, which provides essential health care and supports to 1.2 million Minnesotans, including 42% of Minnesota's children. While the outcome is uncertain, we do know that recent U.S. House budget resolutions calls for $2 trillion in spending reductions. The Commerce and Energy Committee, which oversees Medicaid, is expected to cut $880 billion. How much of that will come from Medicaid is unclear, but it could range from $600 billion to the full $880 billion. A cut of that magnitude would amount to an 8 to 12% reduction in federal Medicaid outlays. If that reduction were distributed proportionately across states, Minnesota could see a reduction of $1.2 to $1.6 billion in FY27 alone, and that amount would increase over time. The Senate budget resolution calls for smaller cuts, so what the end result will be and what the actual financial impact to Minnesota is yet to be determined. But what's important to note here is that under current law, the state will be required to pay any portion of Medicaid costs that the federal government does not. This is true for many other entitlement programs outside of Medicaid as well. If the federal government makes significant reductions in Medicaid, it could result in a dramatic hole in the state's budget. If that happens, Minnesota policymakers would be faced with very difficult choices. They could make changes to entitlement programs to reduce rates, benefits, or eligibility. They could look for new state revenues, or they could make significant cuts in other areas to preserve sufficient funding for the Medicaid entitlement programs. At this point, it's our hope that Medicaid is not cut or that reductions are minimized, but we want to be prepared and appropriately set expectations, in particular as it relates to the forecast we're presenting to you today. What you see here is what we think is accurate now, and future federal changes could have a significant impact on our available resources. Today, we've discussed the budget outlook and the uncertainty associated with federal funding and policy shifts. In the weeks and months ahead, Minnesota policymakers will need to decide how to account for the potential impacts of federal actions and growing projected deficit in the planning years. But as we close out this presentation, I do want to reinforce that we continue to be well positioned to make thoughtful and strategic decisions that will improve our ability to weather and the uncertainty that we've highlighted. As a starting point, we have the benefit of a strong foundation of fiscal planning in Minnesota. The last several forecasts have reflected positive balances in the budget biennia, in part because policymakers had the foresight to leave considerable resources on the bottom line over the last several years. Our 4-year budget and economic forecasts provide information to policymakers that help them understand where anticipated spending growth and revenue do not align, giving them time to understand risks and identify solutions. Between these forecasts, we continue to watch for significant changes through monthly revenue updates and close monitoring of federal actions, along with our quarterly economic and budget updates. And our nation-leading budget reserve policy means that our reserves are fully funded. Keep in mind, those reserves are designed to be a temporary source of funding in the wake of a major unexpected drop of state revenues after a budget has been set, buying policymakers time to make the necessary adjustments to bring the budget into balance. While we don't expect we'll need to tap into those reserves, it is a welcome safety net given the potential uncertainty we're facing. It is more important than ever that policymakers give careful consideration to the factors driving state revenues and spending today, along with anticipated federal funding and policy shifts, in order to shape a state budget that will not only meet Minnesota's needs in the coming biennium, but also set us up for success for years to come. And with that, we're happy to take questions.
Uncertainty on your state, what this is, have you ever seen anything like this in your career where the forecast could change, like you need another forecast during session, action like that?
I think that, I mean, we've chosen to highlight the uncertainty because it does feel really significant in this moment. And you can see how things are changing on a daily basis. That makes it increasingly difficult to understand where things are headed. We are well positioned right now with our monthly budget updates and our quarterly economic updates to provide update to the public and legislators on a regular basis about where we think things are headed. So at this point, we just don't know enough to suggest that we would be having an extra forecast at some point during the year. We will watch the monthly and quarterly updates, and if the need arises, we'll have that conversation. But say if the federal government acts, that's a pretty discrete, I mean, we understand what that number is, and we wouldn't need a forecast to help us understand those actions and the impact on the budget.
Thanks. So the question was about the higher pupil forecasts in the education space. This forecast is the benefit of an additional year of actual data, and whereas in the past we were sort of lagged by a year. And what we are seeing is, so first I'd say we're still projecting pupils will decline over time, but just a slightly slower rate of decline. And the driver is the actual number of kids is not that different than what we had been previously assuming, but the grade levels they're showing up in is different. So the forecast captures change assumptions in like the number of kids advancing from grade to grade, so more kids showing up sort of in some later years, or like a higher proportion of kids advancing from year to year. We should probably, we can talk more about this. It's kind of technical. I don't think, the model doesn't necessarily speak to it. It's a ratio of how many pupils are in 1 year, in a grade level in 1 year, and then what percentage of those kids are in a grade level in the following. And we can follow up with additional detail.
You also mentioned the weight loss there. Where's that spending?
So the medical assistance covers weight loss drugs, and it has for several years. Over the time that we began covering these drugs, there was only one approved by the FDA. Since that time, the list of approved drugs has grown, and the state has to sort of cover all of the drugs within that class. And what we've seen is from 2023 to 2024, a 90% increase, roughly, in the number of patients accessing those drugs through medical assistance. And what that drove was an increase in the rates we're paying to our managed care organizations, who provide coverage for the vast majority of folks who are receiving their health care through medical assistance.
We've heard a lot from the Republican side of the aisle about how the state spends itself. How much do you attribute, I guess, sort of the forecast that we're seeing, that forecast to spending during the previous biennium tax policy?
In terms of the state budget, I mean, there are a lot of different things going on, but it's not accurate to, you have to take spending and revenues together in order to get to the conclusion that we're bringing to you today. Where we have really focused is on where there is growth that is really exceeding revenue growth. And so you know that we've talked about that in places like special education and waiver growth. Anna showed the slide that really depicts the trajectory that those things are on. And those are not decisions that were made necessarily in the last legislative session. Those are things that have been on that trajectory for some time. Well, the devil will be in the details in terms of when, if the federal government acted, resulting in major losses to federal funds at the state level. The answer to that probably depends on the timing in which those federal laws go into effect. If it affects the 26-27 biennium, then I think that there's a good chance that, depending on the time of year, that folks might have to come back to address that problem sooner than later. I think that there's a lot of risk in front of us right now. You've got, a number of policy actions that, again, sort of change day by day. And then you've got the federal funding reductions. And I think that the risk has to be high just based on the value of those resources to the state budget. That's an enormous amount of money. And if federal action meant that we would lose those resources, the impact to the state budget could really be devastating.
This is showing the differences from the November 13th. That's one action.
Yep.
But the bulk of it was in place in November. The changes from November to December are significant. Smaller than we've seen in a lot of forecasts. So the inflationary increases that are causing problems since November are important, but the bulk of this was in place in November. So how much of this is things that happened before November, before Donald Trump entered office? And how much of it is what's happened since November and these changes in spending?
The factors driving the November forecast remain the same in this forecast. In terms of what's driving the change from November, it is largely attributed to inflation. But that doesn't take away from some of the underlying trends that we have been seeing in recent forecasts, in particular in some of the high growth spending areas. So yes, it is at an all-time high right now. It's about $3.5 billion when we include the cash flow account. And the budget reserve is there for an unexpected downturn in revenues after a biennial budget has been set. And so we would really, from MMB's perspective, suggest that we need to that's meant for a moment where if there was an unexpected downturn in the economy and our state revenues really petered off, then that would be the type of moment where we would suggest the budget reserve is appropriate. I do think that it is. We would tell you that today is not the rainy day. I would actually ask Dr. Becker to help me out with that. I'm going to phone a friend.
So, risk of a recession. Yeah, that's a dangerous question. But let me just say that one of the things that I really appreciate about our macro consultant, SPGMI, is that they give us not just a baseline scenario, but also a pessimistic scenario and an optimistic scenario. And they do not have a recession in their pessimistic scenario based on the February 10th release. Now, it's possible that when we see the release it'll be with us in just a few days. We'll get it next week for the March. That'll be interesting to see if their pessimistic scenario has changed, given the movement on tariffs specifically, as well as some of the proposed changes to federal spending that are out there. It doesn't fully factor in tariffs, no. It actually factors in more. I would have to go back and double check all the things that it puts in, but it actually does factor in slightly higher tariffs and different responses to those tariffs. But at this point, it's the uncertainty that is also out there, and in the sense that a lot of businesses, consumers, and so forth are going to delay various plans because of the uncertainty, not because they expect a tariff or they don't expect a tariff, but because they don't know what to expect.
Last question.
It said that the largest individual driver of HHS changes was improper payments for tribal residential facilities on healthcare.
I'll let Director Mingy answer that.
Thanks for the question. The question is about some changes occurring in the current biennium 24-25 in Health and Human Services. The budget forecast reflects $125 million increases in a program known as the Basic Health Fund, which largely pays for substance use disorder services. So this isn't something that's occurring in 26-27 or 28-29. And what occurred is that for several years, the Department of Human Services paid providers, and a portion of those payments were billed to the federal government for services provided in facilities that weren't eligible for federal Indian Health Service funding. And so what the forecast is picking up is just sort of a settle up with the federal government to apply the right payment source to these costs. But I think it's important to note that the amounts paid to the providers were not incorrect. It's just the split between the state and the federal government.
Thank you, everybody.
So I'll just say quick, so there is a classification of treatment settings known as institutions for mental disease. They're places generally with 16 beds or more. They're not eligible for federal Medicaid funding. The state actually has a waiver to allow for treatment in these settings if providers meet certain criteria, and that's something we anticipate will happen over time with these providers. So the setup is, I think, $113 million, and then I think that's in the forecast narrative as well. And I know the governor's here, and I can connect with you after this as well.
Thanks, everybody.
I'll need to circle with you after this and get that information.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, thank you to Minnesota Management and Budget Commissioner Campbell, Minnesota State Budget Director Mingy, and State Economist Dr. Becker. In these unsettled times, there's a lot of work that their team is putting in to make sure we get these numbers and get them correctly. And I'll say what I stood here in November and said, and it holds true, maybe more so now. Minnesota's put our money into things that invested to improve people's lives: public education, tax cuts for the middle class, feeding our kids, education, and innovation in our business community. The challenges you just heard require us, when we put out the original budget, and it is now more important than ever that we implement that, a responsible, measured, honest budget that tackles our challenges at the state level. But what's clear in this budget picture, and you just heard it, is that there is a storm at the federal level, and that storm is Donald Trump. That's the thing that's changed between November and today's numbers. The uncertainty and the destructive chaos is one thing. We walked in here, we talked about the tariffs, and during that time now, we're hearing that some of the things from the USMCA will be exempted from this. This is chaos. It's nonsense. It's not how you run any business, let alone the federal government, and the impact on states is immense. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you how he's going to act. I can tell you yesterday I had conversations with our neighbors and our biggest trading partners, Premier Canoe in Manitoba and Premier Ford in Ontario, and the havoc it's wreaking on their people is being felt. They are going to have to respond accordingly, and the states are going to be put into that situation. Now, look, I know Donald Trump doesn't care about balancing budget. His proposals add $8 trillion to the federal budget. You heard this numbers up here, and I think you're going to get an opportunity to hear some of these leaders up here. I'm going to give a shout out to some of the members of the Republican caucus in the Senate and the House who put Minnesota above politics and wrote a letter that clearly described what the Medicaid cuts would do. I don't believe they agree with me on this. I don't believe they will agree necessarily that the budget is exactly where it's at. But we do have to agree on some facts. Minnesota pays more into the federal government, and the destructive way that these cuts are being implemented will negatively impact, and you heard that, 42% of Americans' children. All for the reason to give tax cuts to the wealthiest folks, some of them who are in charge of making the cuts. It's insanity. Here in Minnesota, we don't do things that way. We've balanced 3 budgets in this administration. We've created record surplus, growth in the economy, through a downturn, through a global pandemic. We've done it bipartisanly in the past. But the reality is this: we have a solid budget, we have surpluses now, but we have some cost drivers over the horizon. So making sure that we're curbing the increases while delivering those services is going to be absolutely critical. You heard that laid out about where the numbers are. You saw what the inflationary impact would have on that. I really appreciate when I heard Commissioner Campbell say, this is not the rainy day. That historic amount that we have in the fund, that's there. The corrections we're talking about, 13 states look over the horizon. 37 states would only show you those first 2 columns. If you just looked at those, everything's fine. $2 billion surplus, everything's fine. The over the horizon, especially in some areas that we can contain costs while still delivering services, keeps us AAA bond rated. It keeps the growth that we're seeing both in population and in business startups, real wealth, and the opportunities of innovation. So we've got an opportunity here to tackle these things. We have an opportunity because we've seen it bipartisanly. Folks in the House and Senate know that we need to watch what the federal government's doing around Medicaid. We need to take care of our most vulnerable. We need to continue to invest in those things that make a difference in people's lives. And when we do so, we end up year after year, balanced budgets, AAA bond rating, and we're going to be able, in this budget that I put forward, is to cut taxes for the middle class, the first ever sales tax cut, and we're going to be able to implement a very aggressive R&D tax credit that will continue to spur the innovation that we're seeing. We were in the Netherlands last week where we saw Philips Corporation make one of their first commitments back into the United States, investing in Plymouth in technology around their medical devices and upstream. We're talking about, and we're in Rotterdam, where we're seeing sustainable aviation fuel up to scale. And the place in the United States that's most apt to be able to do that right now is right here in Northwest Minnesota and connected to the Delta hub at Minneapolis-St. Paul Airport. Those are things that continue to grow the economy. So we need to get a budget done. We need to get a responsible budget done. We need to look to 28, 29 to curb some of the increasing costs, while at the same time continue to invest in the things that helps Minnesota grow. So again, as I would say, that basically the only thing that's changed since November is Donald Trump's chaos to the economy. It changes day to day. It provides the uncertainty that we don't need. And I saw it in Cannon Falls, where we saw our ag producers deeply concerned, and their Canadian counterparts just simply stated the facts. Fertilizer costs are going to cost about $8 an acre for our producers on corn and soybeans because of the potash and the things that the Trump administration has put into place. I think when we see it with our energy costs, and again, talking to the premiers of Manitoba, we receive over 1,300 megawatts of power from Manitoba. It's really important. If we are unable to get it from a friend where we negotiated a fair price, and they're unable to continue to deliver that, our power producers are going to have to go out on a market, and we won't have the leverage to be able to do that, and that will be passed on to consumers and to businesses. So I would encourage, when the Republican folks come up here, they tell us what they're doing to talk to the Trump administration about bringing some sanity back to the budgeting situation. Work with us on getting tax cuts put in place for the middle class here in Minnesota, making sure that we're continuing to invest in our education, make sure we're investing in transportation, that we have those dedicated costs, and continue to see a growth economy that we've seen in Minnesota coming out of the pandemic. With that, I'd be glad to take some questions. Yeah, and as you see, it's around the edges with, when you're talking numbers this big, it's around the edges with the inflation. This was, I believe, predicated on February 10th data, if I'm not mistaken. And as I said, we've had 3 changes in 24 hours to tariffs numbers that have come out. I don't know if we're all getting used to insanity being the norm now, but that is not normal behavior. So what I would say on this is we've got a couple weeks. We will come back. We are not going to chase the chaos. We are going to predicate it on the real numbers that we have, which is this. And I think what you'll see us, we'll come back with those numbers. They will balance as we always do. But I think the base of that budget is now more important than ever to make sure that we're containing those costs in the areas that are driving over the horizon and continue to invest in the things that make us our growth.
Governor, this doesn't have the federal cuts, freezes, layoffs.
No.
Federal government is a top 10 employer, or was a top 10 employer in the state. Do you have a sense of the scale of the layoffs?
Well, and you heard this, that 80,000 at the VA. It's 438,000 at the VA. If somebody comes up to you and tells you, oh, that's not all doctors. Really? People that wash the linens, that keep our veterans safe? The people that do the procurement on the drugs? The people that fix the maintenance system in the building? And somebody who's never served, a billionaire, goes in with an 18-year-old and decides 80,000 of those people aren't worthwhile. This is nuts. And we got to stay balanced here. Well, Governor, there's probably some of those jobs. Yeah, probably. Which ones? You tell me. Show me names. Show me numbers. So yes, I am deeply concerned. Here in Minnesota, someone tell me if I'm forgetting this number. Is it 22,000, I believe, of federal workers, I think, about what we have spread across from the national parks to the weather service to other things. Yes, it will be dramatic with these people going out. Now, the one thing is I'm going to say is we value that. We are aggressively looking if we can hire people into Minnesota, if we can hire them both into state government or we can hire them into the private sector. We're encouraging people to look to Minnesota as a landing spot, but man, it's tough. So yeah, it's a significant impact. And you heard Commissioner Campbell say this. If the budget that they put forward and they voted on goes through, $1.2 to $1.6 billion. And that impact, again, because all the things, if you want to come up here and, the make-believe stuff that the president was saying money was being spent on, that's the fringe on the side. This is Medicare. This is Medicaid. This is transportation funding. And the impact on it, as you heard, a third of our budget. And we in Minnesota are one of the least dependent states on the federal government, and the impact, as Mary mentioned, it will be dramatic. And again, I hope we don't lose this. There's a macro impact of this, which is Dr. Becker's job to tell us on. I think it's our job as elected officials. This is the micro. That's a family that worked hard to serve this country, serve this state, and they are being told that they are not valued and being told to say, list 5 things that you did this week.
When you say hire some of these workers with the state government, are you talking about existing vacancies or?
If we have vacancies open, yeah. If we have experts and we have state veterans homes that we're always trying to find people in. If we have folks that know how to care for veterans, we would look to try and do that. But it's hard to absorb it. Now, look, folks are looking for workers, but these are professionals that are being let go.
Governor, beyond the federal stuff, you've got the forecast showing even more growth with HHS, education, special education, disability waivers. Do you foresee having to have even stronger curbing of that growth as
Well, I think that's what we'll get into. And I think it's because this is reasonable, it's stretched over the 2 bienniums where we get a handle on this, where we don't have that rainy day. It's not a crisis. There's time to do this because everyone here and every legislator that stands in front of you is going to have to recognize that if we don't do this, it will be there. And as I've said, it'll be 1/8 of the budget by 2028, 29. It'll be about half the budget by 2035. I think this path is still there. This is a relatively small on the edges of this to be able to adjust. So I don't think we're going to be asked for any more. And again, the goal of that is not stopping or cutting, curbing growth to fit within where our revenues are. And again, we have an opportunity here to tackle this on the front end so that we don't have to have the crisis situation or the rainy day. So I got one here and then I'll go to the back. Esme? Well, certainly because not in this biennium, we don't have that. We have a surplus. We have a $2 billion surplus we'll end with. This is the over the horizon. And again, if you use that as one-time spending, the cost drivers I'm talking about, you could put $10 billion in one time in it, and all you're doing is prolonging it, and it will be worse when it comes out of that. So we're certainly will do what we can, but I just think if you see the 1.6 billion cut on the conservative side of this, if Minnesota uses half of our surplus to put into that to try and protect, when the real crisis comes on March 14th, if they shut down the government, or if they choose to cut into other things, I think our analysis of this is this could get far worse. We're not in a crisis right now. We're not in a rainy day. Well, I would have our folks come up. We've been through this exercise before. It was Commissioner Franz at the time where our teams will start and they already are on the periphery looking at this. They will start planning what that looks like on the loss of receipts that we're going to receive and all of that. We had to do this back, I believe, was it 2019 when we had this situation when they did shut down. That planning is started now. It will increase dramatically if it looks like it, and I think it doesn't appear to me like they're moving towards a workable solution. But we will be ready for that, and then we'll put out as soon as we can, as we did last time, what those impacts will be. I'll go to the back, Evan. I'm going clear to the back first. Go ahead. That's interesting. The interesting point. The point is with the uncertainty we have, and we do 2-year budgets, I see some accomplished legislators sitting here that I'm going to use my chance to let them maybe talk about this. They do have the experience in this, but I think your point, Evan, is well taken, meaning we do the biennium budgets and then we come back and we do basically off-year policy and bonding or whatever. In today's modern world with the uncertainty, does that make sense? I will defer to the legislators, but I think it's a question we should ask because I do, and it's one that, it got asked, I'm not going to say it, do you do more forecasts? And obviously we have this question, no, not necessarily, but I think all of you get what we're at here. This happened in November, we come out with a forecast and we said, well, there was an election, there'll be changes, won't February look different? Well, here we are, yes. So I hear you, I think it's worth considering. I think, again, that it begs that question, what happens if you do a budget, the legislature starts working, and the federal government makes more massive changes? I think the answer to that is we cross that bridge when we get there. So. You do that when you're a billionaire because it doesn't really impact you. So I'm just saying, I'm not surprised by that.
He said hundreds of billions of dollars of manufacturing investment going to come in. Do you buy that? And if not, do you have fear that there's going to be a recession?
Yeah. Look, I'm not going to speculate to that point. I think you prepare for that. But let me just say this about what he said. It's not just that I don't agree with that. It's that not a single economist agrees with that anywhere. It's not another country's budget director agrees with that. And the history of economic use of tariffs and trade wars like this, there is no instance of doing any of the things that he said. So I don't know what else to say on this. It isn't political for me, and I would love this. If everything he said, we saw massive growth, massive remanufacturing, massive numbers. We find workers apparently that are around that, we all know how hard that is to find. If all of those things worked, that's great. My beef with him is not that I just want to pick a fight. My beef is this is lunacy. And I will make the case on this. Coming from someone who not only could not do budgets, could not do business budgets, and could not keep businesses in place. When you have a casino and you can't make money, that ought to tell you something. At a time when more people are going to get laid off and need to do this? Well, we'll always look for cost reduction, but I'm not interested in cutting benefits to people. I'm not interested in us joining the rest of the 197 countries of the world that have paid family medical leave. I think us in Yemen, maybe. I want to be in that because what we know is states and countries that have paid family medical leave have higher production, they have higher consistency in their work, they have a higher quality of life, and people, for goodness sakes, You should not have to go broke because you got to go get chemo or you got to take your kids because they're sick. So we were willing to work. We had this discussion. Kicking the can down the road, no, we're not going to do that.
Will this new forecast call for major revisions to your budget?
No.
And especially on the Medicaid issue that already got a lot of pushback last time.
Yeah, no, it won't have major, Tom's question, the major revisions. No, it's the inflationary costs on the edge. It's why I'm glad we take and budget for inflation, and now we're seeing what the effects of inflationary change will make. No, it will still be there. I would say this, it reinforces the need, because again, I just said there's just two universals in this. Do you want your taxes cut? Yes. Do you want your services cut? No. You got to figure out how those two things blend together. And in Minnesota, we do a very good job of this. We're in a very solid spot. We're not talking about cutting services. We're talking about curbing growth to be manageable so that we can spend and do the things in other areas, like cutting sales taxes, like cutting and improving the R&D tax credit. So no, this should be relatively around the edge. But the question that Evan was asking and others is, by the time you get this out, at the pace we're on, what we saw 3 today, say it takes us 14 days, I'll see 42 different positions from the Trump administrations on tariffs. That warrants having to take another look.
So specifically on the Medicaid issue, you don't expect that to get any deeper?
Well, I think we'll work with them. No, not exponentially. There'll be things around the edge that we will have to look at in terms of this. I think we were looking at 1%, so we'll 1.1%, 1.2%. All right.
How much do you plan to travel around the country and do town hall meetings? You talked about a shadow government the other day.
Yeah, look, my job here is be governor. I'm here, I do this. I got a lot of energy, as I've said. I don't even think the Republicans would criticize if I wasn't as around as much because they probably don't want to see me. I'll go where it needs to go because I think there's an issue here. These policies impact the middle class. These policies are good. We're seeing the opposite of this, which is chaos, tax cuts for the wealthy, layoffs of workers, just all of that. The contrast is so great, we have to figure out how to make the case. And I said, if you won't go sit in front of people and do your town halls, we should open up that space to let people speak because the answers are going to come from folks. They're going to tell you how they feel. And I've been there. I was there, members of Congress. I've been here at State Fair. I get an earful. The times when we make that available are really important. So we'll do our job here, but we'll be able to get around. Well, that's not true. So, we have met. We have sat in the rooms. We've met. The legislative leaders are there. Look, we're early in the session. What are you bringing me? You know when I'll meet with Republican leaders? When you produce a budget, when you show me numbers. You're not going to come in and criticize mine where you're like, ours is better, but it's top secret. No, bring it in. There's time. There's work to be done. And you know what work doesn't need to be done today? Figuring out and trying to pass a bill so you can shoot somebody for taking your parking space. Work on the budget. Do your job. Work on your budget. Oh, I don't know what President Trump is going to do. Officer Chauvin has he has 22 years of state time that he will do. All right. Thanks, folks. Thank you, guys. Did I have that right on that? The 1.26? All right. Got it.
You ready? I'm not in charge of logistics. All right. My name is Erin Murphy. I'm the Senate Majority Leader. I'm here with Speaker Emerita Hortman, and we know how to balance the budget. A forecast is, by its very definition, about the future and what lies ahead. It guides us, helping us to know what to expect as we move forward so that we can make good choices and plan for what's coming for the people of Minnesota, the place that we call home. Today's not a day to look backward, but to be clear-eyed about what comes next. Today's forecast tells us that in this present moment, we have a stably balanced budget, we have a surplus, we have a stable economy, and we have the strongest budget reserve in the state's history. It tells us that in Minnesota, we have made sound decisions, we are good fiscal stewards, and we are in a strong position to face what lies ahead. Minnesotans elected us to take on challenges, to tackle hard conversations, and find creative, meaningful solutions. We together have faced worse economic positions in the past. With strong leadership and the contributions of hardworking Minnesotans and the economy they create, we have turned potential deficits into surpluses. But never in our history have we had to do that work up against a president who seems hell-bent on crashing the American economy. Only one thing has changed since the November forecast, and that is the inauguration of President Donald Trump. In the last 50 days, the stock market has tanked and more than 170,000 Americans have lost their jobs. In Minnesota, his recklessness has shrunk our state surplus by $160 million. Trump and Elon Musk are bragging about their chaos. They're causing it, and my Republican colleagues here are standing with him, cheering them on, in some cases hiding from the public. Trump, Musk, and the Republicans in Congress are threatening to cut $2 trillion in essential services, programs people in every community rely on, like Medicaid and Social Security. Their budget would hurt schools, hospitals, seniors and children, farmers, people with disabilities, veterans, teachers, manufacturers, small businesses, and factories, and could have a devastating effect on our budget here in Minnesota, all to pay for tax cuts for the billionaires. Trump, Musk, and the Republicans in Congress have got to pull their heads out of their asses and get to work for the people of this country. The Democrats here will continue to stand up for all Minnesotans, and we will pass a balanced, equitable budget that does everything we can to protect Minnesotans from Trump's chaos and Musk's chainsaw. Our Republican colleagues here at home need to join us and get real about the threat of this president and his billionaire friends. I call on them to join us in this fight, to fight for Minnesotans, for our institutions, and for our future.
Good there. You don't feel like you're balancing. Okay. Good afternoon. Minnesota is in good economic shape. That's what we're seeing in the current biennium. We have a $3.7 billion cash on hand surplus. In the biennium to come, we have $1.1 billion available to spend on inflationary increases in programs, and then we have $616 million left over after that. Minnesota is in good economic shape after 2 years of Democratic control. But we're already starting to see the negative impacts of Donald Trump's chaos, cruelty, incompetence in Washington, D.C. with the tariffs and increasing inflation and the uncertainty taking a toll on our economy and our state budget. Consumer confidence is plummeting. Grocery prices continue to go up. Experts are cutting projections for economic growth. You can see in the forecast that you just received, GDP is projected to go down. Inflation is projected to go up. Mortgage rates are projected to go up. Donald Trump is wrecking our economy. Manufacturers have reported steep declines in new orders and employment. We know that tariffs will raise prices for Minnesotans and alienate some of our closest allies and trading partners. Just yesterday, ADP reported that private employers added only half the jobs projected in February. Critical federal funding has been frozen. Dedicated public servants have been fired, all thanks to Donald Trump and Elon Musk's erratic actions, creating havoc in the markets and in the federal government. And this forecast does not account for anything that's happened since February 10th. As the governor noted, at the rate they're going, they'll change their position on tariffs 42 more times. Things have rapidly trended negative, even in just the last week, and it seems like they're promising to make it worse. Today's near and long-term economic forecast is helpful and necessary for the legislature and the governor to put together a state budget that is balanced for the current term and then balanced ongoing. But there are irresponsible cuts that are proposed at the federal level that will swamp everything we've done here. I think you saw they left slide 19 up for quite an extended period of time. You could see in the state budget, $84 billion in revenue comes from state sources and $45 billion from the federal government. If we look out in the out years and we use the non-inflation adjusted numbers, or the inflation adjusted number of a potential $6 billion deficit, $2.4 billion if you don't count inflation, that is just absolutely swamped by $45 billion in federal funding that is entirely at risk under this chaotic administration. Instead of bringing down prices like they promised on the campaign trail, Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress are working to enact trillions in tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, and they're going to pay for it by slashing federal spending on education and health care for children, families, seniors, and people with disabilities. Thanks to responsible DFL budgeting, we are in good shape. We are looking forward to working on a bipartisan basis to ensure that Minnesota stays in good shape and that we have surpluses in the future as well. Certainly that will take some management as we look at those details. But we are in good shape and we have the highest budget reserve ever. We are going to be, as Democrats, fighting to protect working class Minnesotans. In the last 2 years, you've seen Democrats working together to improve the situation for working Minnesotans and consumers vis-a-vis corporations that exercise excessive power to our disadvantage. We see Republicans fighting to preserve the status quo, where billionaires rig the economy to accumulate more power and wealth. But we'll keep fighting for workers and consumers, and we look forward to working together with Republicans to balance the budget. With that, we will take questions. Well, I would say we will enact a balanced budget by the time the legislative session is over. And if we have to come back in September and October, if the Republicans in Congress and the president screw it all up, we'll come back in September or October.
We have to balance the budget. It's our obligation. We do it with this forecast in mind. We hope that the Republicans in the Congress change their minds and don't roll over to Donald Trump and do what he is suggesting they should do, because that would hurt the people of Minnesota. But for now, we're going to balance this budget to this forecast, and we're going to be done, knock on wood, by May 19th.
Go ahead.
We are, our caucus has been digging into this question now for many weeks, and there are many places to look in order to balance the budget. And we are going to consider the current agencies, the current budgets. We're going to take a look at things that we've appropriated for but haven't received a federal match, and that we don't anticipate a federal match given the new administration. So we're going through everything with a fine-tooth comb, but our objective is to balance the budget, to balance it out for the people of Minnesota, and to protect Minnesotans, particularly against the harms that are coming our way from Washington, D.C.
There's just two things I would say in response to that question. Number one, the governor has proposed bending the cost curve on the rate at which expenses for disability waiver services are going up in special education. And like he said, he's not proposing a cut. He's proposing to slow down the rate of growth. So certainly we have to look at government programs where the rate of growth is higher than the rate of inflation. But you also referenced the carry forward, and the carry forward is critically important. As Democrats, we're leaving $3.7 billion cash on the bottom line. That's a big deal. Of the $17.5 billion surplus, there's 6.2 sitting around right now available to be used, 3.5 in the reserves and 3.7 in cash. If we can, with the Republicans, next biennium, leave Minnesota in that good of shape, there wouldn't be a deficit in the out years, because the $6 billion number, you have to understand, is a very conservative number because we put inflation back into the budget forecast. because we used to not include that. And then people would wonder why it felt like we were running very fast and standing in the same place, because we weren't increasing government funding to keep up with inflation. Adding inflation to the general education formula means that each year of the forecast period, funding for K-12 education will increase automatically. And that's important, and that should happen. School districts shouldn't come here and fight really hard just to get 2.5%. So that's a dramatic improvement in the budget. It's a very responsible forecast that we work to make more responsible and more reflective of reality. Peter. That's right.
Before Donald Trump took office. So you speak to that. I know you did in November, but you can't blame all of the $5.6 billion structural deficit on what's happened since Donald Trump was president. When $5.2 billion of it was there before.
Right. And I think that we've all been very clear what we're blaming on Donald Trump is the difference between the November forecast and the February forecast. When you look at the out years, those are certainly structural issues that we know from a demographic perspective we're going to be affecting Minnesota. We've been talking about this since 2005, my first year in the legislature. We have a silver tsunami. It's expensive to take care of our aging parents. I don't know about you, but I am ill-equipped to have my parents come live with me in my house and take care of them should they develop disabilities or need care. There's a whole system that we provide in the state of Minnesota and that we generously fund in the state of Minnesota to take care of people. That is expensive. As more of them retire and age into that system, it is more expensive.
From my perspective, that is for a rainy day and not for budget balancing. So you may have seen in the news recently that the Republicans in Congress have been asked not to do town halls in public. That seems to be hiding from the public. From my perspective as an elected official, the voters are the bosses, and we should be available to them. We are, they're not our subjects. We are essentially there to work for them. Regarding like heads out of asses, I will say that as we have been talking specifically about the budget resolution that was just passed in Washington in the House of Representatives, as we have talked about that issue, the jobs that are being cut, the contracts that have been frozen, the response that I'm most often getting from my Republican colleagues is, you know what, they're going to figure that out. That's not a real thing. We don't have to worry about it. It's a distraction. They're going to find waste in Social Security. They're going to find waste in medical assistance. They're going to find waste in Medicare. Those are important programs for the people of Minnesota. And so I think that we have to be clear-eyed and steely-eyed about what we could face. And so to Esme Murphy's question, the 3.5 that is in reserve could come in pretty handy if that budget resolution of $880 billion becomes law and we lose a lot of funding for our state budget here. That would come in handy in that moment, and that's why I don't think it is available for spending right now.
The House and Senate bear any responsibility for that $6 billion projected deficit because of decisions you made in the last budget that increased spending by a big amount?
No, that is far beyond the period that we budgeted for. For the period that we budgeted for, there are surpluses as far as the eye can see. Now, this is new information, and we will do what we always do, is we will balance the budget so that what you see in an economic projection, kind of long down the road, further than most states look, will be balanced by the time we leave here.
But structurally, those things carry on.
Absolutely.
What you do in the short term has an impact on the long term.
And that's why we're here now, is to budget for that period. That is our job this session. To budget for actually the 2 years preceding that, but to balance into the tails.
You know what? I'm going to spend a fair amount of time between now and when we announce targets with my colleagues, and we'll keep you posted. by April 5th.
And the House will have budget targets by April 1st. House DFL will put our proposal forward prior to that, then we'll compromise with our Republican colleagues and have hopefully joint targets by April 1st. Thanks. We'll let you talk to the Republicans.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here with us today. As you heard, the work done by MMB and the good work that they do gave us a true picture of where Minnesota truly is right now when it comes to our budget. I'd like to remind the room that just in 2 years ago, we had an $18 billion surplus, and then hit family budgets even harder with raising taxes and fees by another $10 billion to fund the spending spree that we saw happen here in the state of Minnesota under one-party Democrat control in just 2 short years. In the November forecast, we knew that we were looking at a $5.1 billion deficit. And as you can see today, that has gotten even worse. We are now looking at a $6 billion deficit. Democrats in the state, as you have heard, want to go ahead and blame anyone else for the damage that has happened to our state budget. But this was an irresponsible spending spree. And now we have to figure that out. But before Democrats actually spent it all and raised taxes and fees, we actually had the money in the bank to handle any potential shortages in any area, any uptick in costs, but that was all spent. We had been warning over 2 years that this was not going to be sustainable, that we couldn't have excess spending and raising of taxes and fees in this way, or we would be headed for a deficit. Under one-party Democrat control, our voices and our votes were not needed, and that is why we are here right now today. While our revenue grows in the state of Minnesota, our spending has gone even faster. But looking forward, knowing that we have a deadline of May 19th to pass a state budget, that will be a bipartisan budget. And we know that. My expectation is that Democrats are going to meet with us. They're going to meet together, and we will come to the table with both tax-saving cuts and absolutely no tax increases. We've got to come together to fix the mess that we find ourselves in today. You might ask, well, what things are you going to cut? Our chairs of every committee had reached out to the agencies in December, asking for ways to find cost savings within their agencies, to review those areas so that we could start that work early in December, knowing that we were going to have to find some savings. We're still trying to wait, or we are still actually waiting for that information. Some have given it to us. Some we look forward to those continued conversations. But Republicans are ready to work on a responsible and balanced budget that's going to fund our priorities. It will protect vulnerable Minnesotans, yet we are going to address the fiscal disaster that Democrats in the state of Minnesota have created. We can't take time blaming a new administration for problems that were caused over the last 2 years under one-party Democrat control. We have to work together. I have requested standing meetings with our governor 2 months ago. I'm still waiting for those to happen. But I look forward to working with my Democrat colleagues both in the House, in the Senate, and then with our governor as we go forward. With that, I would like you to hear from Majority Leader Niska.
Thank you, Speaker Demuth. And, you know, it's been interesting to hear the way the Democrats have tried to distract and deflect from their failed record, and they want to talk about everything else other than what's happening in our Minnesota budget and in our Minnesota policy, in our Minnesota, as a result of Minnesota policies. But the reality is, and what we see in the budget forecast, is that our fiscal house is out of order at the state level, and it's out of order because our state economy is fundamentally out of balance. It's very clear when you look at the long-term budget forecast that our government is too big and it's growing bigger, and our private economy is being stifled by the massive increases in government spending, government taxes, and government regulation. If you just look at slide 18, it shows, contrary to the Democrats' claims of responsible budgeting, that in fact the structural imbalance, not looking at the carry forwards, not looking at where we are at our current cash position, the structural imbalance, the money going out compared to the money coming in, is bad, it's out of balance, and it's getting worse. It's actually doubling every budget cycle shown on that. It's $3 billion and then $6 billion. If you use inflation, it's $2 billion and then $4 billion if you're not counting inflation. Our budget problem is not because of including inflation in our budget projections. It's not because of anything happening outside of the state of Minnesota. It's happening because our budget, our government policies and our fiscal policies are putting a fundamental imbalance between the size of government and the size of the rest of the economy. And that's what Republicans are focused on, making sure that we do responsible budgeting, that we find savings where we can, but that we find ways to unleash the private economy so that we can pay for all of the government services that all of us expect to happen. So I'll now turn it over to our Senate Leader, Mark Johnson.
Well, thank you, Leader Niska and Speaker Damath. Appreciate it, and thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm Senate Republican Leader Mark Johnson, and I just am proud to have the opportunity to really set the record straight. Look, we've received two forecasts this week. The first one left a little bit of mess out on our roads, but the second one is going to leave a mess of our economy going forward. And so Democrats have clearly broken Minnesota's budget. The deficit that they are leaving behind is going to be a mess that we are going to have to be cleaning up this session, and we're going to be working hard for that. Their ridiculous spending of over $18 billion of our surplus over the last 2 years, the $10 billion of taxes that they've raised on our businesses and our families and our communities are really hampering the growth of this economy. Minnesotans sent a clear message, didn't they? Democrats' out of control spending has to stop. We got to put Minnesota budget first. Minnesota Democrats are constantly blaming DC, but there is no one to blame but themselves. They squandered the surplus, they raised taxes, they wasted $500 million in fraud. The reality is, Walz's administration has grown spending to unsustainable levels. Minnesotans haven't experienced similar growth in their personal budgets and cannot afford to be treated as bottomless piggy banks right now. Simply put, Democrats have put us in an unsustainable spending path, and that will hurt every Minnesotan. We need to put the budget first of Minnesotans, protecting their income, funding their priorities, and stopping the fraud and reducing government growth. With that, we're open for questions. What's fun, and thank you for that question. So it's about the letter that some Republicans have signed on to over the last couple of weeks here. I think what we were looking at there is, as this process is going in Washington, D.C., what is great to see is that it's no longer the status quo in D.C., and we're actually asking those tough questions of how we're going to be funding priorities, not just in Minnesota, but across the country. And so this was an opportunity to have that open dialogue, which for so long has been really a third rail, and we haven't been able to discuss. So now just being able to explore the possibilities is really refreshing. I think a lot of Minnesotans and across the country should be excited about what is happening, and everybody can have their input into that.
What about the uncertainty, though, it creates potentially the federal freeze, cuts, layoffs are not in this forecast. We saw the chart, a third of state budget is federal money, top 10 employer, or was a top 10 employer in the state. The impact could
Sure.
be real.
Yeah, and Mary, I think one of the interesting things too is you hear the Democrats continually talk about the 42 changes in tariffs that have gone back and forth and the uncertainty there. what's great is to see that we're opening up those negotiations. Tariffs are being used as a tool to open up negotiations so Minnesotans, manufacturers, their trade goods, their commodities, we will try to get better deals for those across the globe. And so, yes, they throw out the boogeyman of Trump and all that stuff, but the reality is this is a new day in America, an opportunity for Minnesota to be a stronger state. And quite frankly, we're excited about what's going to be happening. In many ways, an opportunity to grow this economy.
Could the speaker address that as well, the loss of federal funds, the third budget with it?
I think the important thing that we recognize right now is where we find ourselves regardless of what we saw today, $6 billion deficit. This is time to rein in spending in the state of Minnesota. As far as the things that are actually being talked about potentially through the media and coming out of Washington, D.C., we don't know if that is going to happen or to what extent. We can look at that and have that information, but we have to focus on what we are doing here in the state of Minnesota. Absolutely. We have 6,000 new FTEs that were created in the state of Minnesota just over the last 2 years. We have $1 billion that has gone to nonprofits. Now, nonprofits in the state of Minnesota do a great job, some of them, but yet we know that there's a number of unaccountable nonprofits. We have over $600 million in known fraud in the state of Minnesota that until Republicans started, and we have the one-seat advantage right now, and we have a fraud prevention committee, that fraud has gone unanswered for. We have millions of dollars going out in empty trains. That is what we have to take a look at in the state of Minnesota first, before we even consider what could be a potential federal change to our income. We have wasteful money, wasteful spending, fraud, and an excess and bloat of government that we do not need in the state of Minnesota. That's what we have to come to terms with and work on. Other questions? Esme. Before we would even look at a rainy day spending, we have to get our actual spending, or using that reserve, we have to get our actual spending under control. That has not taken place over the last 2 years, and we know that. We have to balance this budget, and we can do it without dipping into that at this point. We can get our work done on time. May 19th is when we have to have that work done. Even with a 4-week delay because Democrats did not show up for work in the House of Representatives, that will not be an excuse of why we can't get the work done on time for Minnesotans with a balanced budget and a reduction in the spending so that we can go forward and have a strong state in that we need. Other questions? We know right now the position that the Democrats in the state of Minnesota have pushed us in is unsustainable. That's what we're going to focus on first. Regardless of what happens at a federal or a national level, we will continue to consider those things. But right now, we have to rein in the spending that we saw with out of control Democrats spending taxpayer money. Other questions? I'm going to let our Ways and Means Chair, Chair Torkelson, address how we might look at potential cuts.
Well, thank you for that question. Paul Torkelson, Chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House. We have been examining the state budget carefully in every budget area. We have no intention of doing straight across the board cuts. We intend to do the work to find first unspent funds that we can claw back, identify where fraud has happened, and cut state agencies where we can. You might remember that when they created the Children and Families Administrative Department, they took parts of other agencies to build it, but they didn't reduce those agencies at all in far as their complement of employees. State government has grown dramatically in this last biennium, and we intend to draw that back down. It's time to make Minnesota government the right size. Well, we have work to do, and it's not going to be easy. I'm challenging the leaders on both sides of the building to come to joint targets sooner rather than later.
We've already wasted a lot of time this session. The first act of the session had no Democrats on the stage, as you might remember, and we're waiting now for the results of a special election. But we have a lot of work to do in a short time. The sooner we can agree to joint targets, the better we can do that work. And so I'm challenging the leaders of the Democrats, both in the Senate and the House, to come to joint targets quickly rather than spending a lot of time trading barbs with each other when we need to get the work done. Well, if we end up tied, and we don't know that for a fact yet, yes, I think committees are going to act differently than they ever have before. We've never worked with tied co-chairs and with tied number of members on committees, and yes, I do agree with you that it'll be more like a conference committee work, but we don't know that because we haven't done it yet, and the challenge lies ahead of us. All the more reason to get to these joint targets quickly.
Speaker David, a question to you. Your response to Governor Walz bringing a lot of this on the insanity of President Trump and the majority leader in the Senate saying they've got to pull their heads out of their asses. Your response to that type of language and approach, how helpful or unhelpful is that?
The language and approach that we heard today and we hear from our Democrat colleagues on a number of occasions is disrespectful. This is not the time for disrespect in the state of Minnesota. We have to work together all along the campaign trail and leading up to this point. I had talked about balanced government. We don't have to agree on everything, but we do have the opportunity to work together in a respectful way. And that is what I expect both from the Republicans that I work with and from the Democrats. That's where we need to start the work ahead.
If I could just add on to that too. And we saw last week the Senate Republicans, really we had a press conference on that after the governor called Republican leaders and Republicans across the country Nazis and fascists. Now we see them up here using crass language. Really, I think their narrative is, hey, let's distract you. It's almost like Chicken Little right now, running around saying the sky is falling. But when it comes to state issues, they become ostriches and put their head in the sand. And so when the majority leaders up here are saying that Republicans need to look around and see what's going on, reality is they're just trying to distract Minnesotans from the real problems, and we want to try to get that done, but they're wrecking relationships over and over again. It's hard to get together when they're calling you names like that.
Madam Speaker, one quick follow-up. You have not been able to pass one bill with 68 votes, a consequential bill anyway. How difficult is it going to be if you go back in time to get to 68 votes on anything budget?
We have passed just a couple of bills on a bipartisan basis off the House floor. We have a number of bills up today. There could be some passage of some of those bills. But I think the important thing to recognize is the work that we do together. The message that I'd like to have each one of you take out of this room today is that under full one-party Democrat control, $18 billion of surplus was spent. Taxes and fees on all of us in the state of Minnesota was raised by another $10 billion. We now know that there is a $6 billion deficit, yet we need to function as a legislature and as the government, deliver to the people of Minnesota those core priorities and the things that they need. Our kids need to be able to read at grade level. We need safe communities. We have to reduce our taxes so Minnesotans can afford their lives, and we need an environment that we can all grow in where our businesses, our schools, our hospitals can succeed. That is the takeaway, regardless of the disrespectful language or the deflection to Washington, D.C. We, as House Republicans and my Republican colleagues in the Senate, are focused on the work at hand. We have just a few short months to accomplish that. That is what we are planning to do. I believe that what you saw over the last time that the governor ran for national office really shined a light on his actual record and the things that were happening here in Minnesota. I talked to a number of Minnesotans across the state that had no idea the amount of money that was spent over the last 2 years. They had no idea about some of the social issues. It really did shine a light on Minnesota, and let people know we have a lot of work to do. I would hope that our governor would prioritize his work here in Minnesota as governor of our state, work with legislative leaders, actually respond if I've asked for some type of a standing meeting to build that relationship as we work toward that balanced budget. I would hope that his first priority would be the state of Minnesota right now, and that is my expectation. Any other questions? Peter? What we will do is, if those do become a reality, we will have clear communication with our congressional delegation. Right now, the things that are being proposed in Washington are hypothetical because they're not actually happened right now. They have not taken place yet. Those are all things that they're working in Washington. My main focus right now is trying to get this balanced budget here in the state of Minnesota, building working relationships. We have a special election on Tuesday that will determine what the House of Representatives looks like going forward. We will either be in a true majority if Paul Wickstrom wins, or we will be returned to a tie in which we already have an organizational agreement that would support that. Our work is focused here in Minnesota, taking into consideration if there are changes at a federal level that impact us, and then we will work through that.
And if I could jump onto that. So Rochelle, your question was simply, you know, what's happening up in DC, how that's going to impact our budgeting then in just, right? That's. So we had a great conversation there. But I think what you want to do here is look at the slides that were up. We're sitting at a structural deficit of $3.1 or $3.2 billion here in the state of Minnesota because of Democrats spending. And so we've got to be focusing on that. I know that the governor, he's more interested in campaigning right now on a national level. But the reality is we have to be looking at the numbers here in the state. And when you have a $3.2 billion deficit, let's address these problems first before we start getting into the hypotheticals of what's going on in DC. I really think he did a good job at distracting a lot of folks out here because this is the topic that keeps coming up. What about this over there? But the reality is we have issues right here in the state right now. That's our jobs. We're going to be working on that and focusing on that. And we've got an elected delegation out in DC that we've had great conversations with. Their reconciliation process is going to be continuing and ongoing. And we'll see what happens there, but voice your concerns with those folks. We definitely have to look at the way that paid family medical leave is structured right now. What we have heard from businesses, from school districts, from hospitals, that this is not going to be sustainable. We have a program that hasn't even started, and it's already had to have additional money infused. The tax has been raised on every employer, which then can be passed on to the employees. And there's no minimum. If you have one employee, you're on the hook for this program that is going to create workforce shortages. It is potentially going to damage businesses in the state of Minnesota. Businesses can take care of their employees and provide what is needed. We are looking for meaningful adjustments to that paid family medical leave as we move forward. We've got a great team within our caucus working on that, and you will see those proposals rolling through as we move forward. We need changes to what is currently out there. Thank you.